A sentence with the form, if P then Q, is called a conditional sentence. The P and the Q are placeholders, that is, they are containers for other statements. So, for example, it may be, if it is raining, then the ground is wet. The first statement, the P, is called the antecedent. This is a technical term, meaning that it comes before something else. You may be familiar with other words or phrases that use the prefix ante, meaning before. 10 o'clock in the morning is 10 a.m. The AM stands for antemeridium, which is Latin for before midday. Although the first statement is called the antecedent because it comes first, this only means it comes first in the sentence. It doesn't mean it necessarily comes first in the actual order of events. For example, if you have the conditional sentence, if the water is hot, then the water has been heated, the statement, the water is hot, is still the antecedent. You can think of the antecedent as the statement that comes before the word, then. The statement that comes after the word then, is called the consequent. This sounds a little like the word consequences, and that is often what it is. In our first sentence, if it is raining, then the ground is wet. The ground being wet is presumably a consequence of the fact that it is raining. However, it, too, is a technical word, and simply refers to the second part of a conditional sentence. It doesn't mean that it has necessarily been caused by what was mentioned in the first part of the conditional sentence. In our second example, if the water is hot, then the water has been heated. The water has been heated, is still the consequent. Although the water being heated isn't a consequence of the water being hot, what we can say is that our ability to know that the water has been heated is a consequence of our knowing that the water is hot. With conditional sentences, there are a number of things to think about. The antecedent, the first bit, may be true or false. It may or may not be raining. The consequent, the second bit, may be true or false. The ground may or may not be wet. Also, the whole sentence may be true or false. Even if both the antecedent and consequent are false, it isn't raining and the ground isn't wet, it is still possible for the whole sentence to be true, for it may be that, if it were raining, then the ground would be wet. The only combination that the whole sentence rules out is where the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. If it is raining and the ground isn't wet, then our conditional statement must be false. It is worth noting that in everyday language the sentence may be constructed slightly differently. For example, the word then might be replaced by a comma. For example, if the weather improves, we'll go for a walk. Different tenses might be used, and, if the claim is about something that is recognized as fact, then the word when might be used instead of the word if. For example, when water freezes, it expands. However, we will stick with the basic formulation, if P then Q. Let's take a closer look at what the conditional statement is claiming. The statement, if P then Q, is claiming that whenever P is true, then it will also be the case that Q is true. It is not making a claim about why this is, it is not claiming that P being true causes Q to be true. It is saying that, for whatever reason, if P is true, then so is Q. It is impossible for P to be true and Q to be false. Another way to think about this is to say that the conditional sentence is claiming that, if you know P to be true, then you have sufficient grounds for knowing Q to be true. You may discover the truth of Q in all sorts of other ways. You may look out of the window and see that the ground is wet, but, if the conditional sentence is true, then you wouldn't need to look out of the window. If the conditional sentence is true, then, if you know it is raining, you will also know that the ground is wet. You don't need to look to find out. In a similar way, the conditional sentence is claiming that Q being true is a necessary condition of P being true. It is claiming that there are no possible circumstances where P is true but Q is false. We have said that the conditional sentence is claiming that, if the antecedent is true, then so is the consequent. However, if the conditional sentence is true, then there is something else we can say. If Q is false, then P must also be false. This isn't so obvious, but it has to be. If the sentence, if it is raining then the ground is wet, is true, then, if we know that the ground isn't wet, we also know that it isn't raining, because, if it were, then the ground would be wet. Sometimes people get these the wrong way round. If you know that P is false, this doesn't mean that you automatically know Q is false. If you know it isn't raining, this doesn't mean you automatically know that the ground isn't wet. Similarly, if you know that Q is true, you don't automatically know that P is true. If you know that the ground is wet, you don't automatically know that it is raining. Let's look at these two mistakes in a bit more detail. These two mistakes are called formal fallacies. A fallacy is a way of labeling certain common errors of reasoning. They are called formal fallacies because the mistake is to do with the form, that is, the structure of the argument, rather than with any specific content. The first mistake is called the fallacy of denying the antecedent. The argument looks like this. If P then Q, not P, therefore, not Q. Of course, there is really nothing wrong in saying that the antecedent is false. Using our earlier example, you might look out of the window and see that it is, in fact, not raining. The mistake is in thinking that, combined with our conditional statement, something follows from the fact that it isn't raining. The conditional statement tells us what we can know if the antecedent is true. It doesn't tell us anything about what we can know if it is false. We certainly cannot conclude that the ground isn't wet. It may be wet for all sorts of other reasons. Maybe it was raining earlier, maybe the ground is being watered by a sprinkler, and so on. Since it is possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, any argument that has this form, irrespective of the content, is an invalid argument. The second mistake is called the fallacy of affirming the consequent, and the argument looks like this. If P then Q, Q, therefore, P. Once again, there is really nothing wrong in noting that the consequent is true. The mistake is in thinking that this tells us something about the antecedent. It may indeed be that the ground is wet. But, as we have just seen, this can be true for all sorts of reasons unconnected with the antecedent. Once again, it is possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, so any argument that has this form, has this structure, will be an invalid argument. The fallacy of denying the antecedent makes the mistake of treating the antecedent as if it is a necessary condition, when it isn't. Our conditional sentence is telling us that the antecedent is a sufficient condition for the truth of the consequent. It isn't telling us that it is a necessary condition. Similarly, the fallacy of affirming the consequent is making the mistake of treating the consequent as if it is a sufficient condition for the truth of the antecedent. It isn't. Our conditional sentence tells us that the consequent is a necessary condition of the antecedent being true. Rightly or wrongly, It tells us that it can't be raining without the ground being wet. It doesn't tell us that, seeing the ground is wet, is enough to tell us that it is raining. There are interesting questions as to why these kinds of mistakes are so common. It may be that the human brain simply isn't well adapted to making some kinds of logical deduction. What we can say is that some arguments with this form, although invalid, do, at first sight, look quite convincing. Consider the following example. If the key fits, it will open the lock. It doesn't fit, so it won't open the lock. This has the logical form of denying the antecedent, so we know it is invalid. It is a bad argument. Nevertheless, it may look like a reasonable argument. Perhaps the reason for this is that we have some background knowledge about the first premise. We may know that, if the key fits, it will open the lock, but we also know that, only if the key fits will it open the lock. Or, to put it another way, if the key fits it will open the lock, but if it doesn't, it won't. If this were the premise in our argument, there wouldn't be a problem. Perhaps sometimes when people make the mistake of denying the antecedent or affirming the consequent, it is because they are wrongly assuming that the statement, if P, then Q, really means, if, and only if P, then Q.